Welcome to the NutriHealth Podcast, where we provide credible, no-hype health, wellness, and nutrition information that actually moves the needle towards better long-term health. Welcome to episode 7 of the NutriHealth Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Glenn, and today in our series looking at various eating patterns, we're reviewing Whole30, Paleo, and Primal, which are very similar, and then we'll have a short discussion of the Carnivore Diet and the Lion Diet at the end. I'm also excited because we have our first guest of the podcast today. My friend Alicia Dowell, a holistic nutritionist, will be joining us for part of our Whole30 discussion a bit later. I'm also going to go ahead and apologize right now. I'm either fighting a cold or some allergies, so I hope that my voice doesn't get too nasally as we go through here. We are going to get a broad overview of the eating patterns up for discussion today, and then dive a little deeper into each of them to help you understand the general principles, foods to consume or avoid on the eating pattern, potential health benefits and risks, and more, just as we've done with our previous episodes. If you're here for a specific eating pattern of those I just mentioned, feel free to skip around the episode using the timestamps I've provided in the notes section. This is the 7th and next to last episode in our series all about helping you find your food fit, a pattern of eating that you feel you can stick to, that is getting you closer to your health goals and works with your food preferences and lifestyle. We've previously covered the Mediterranean and related diets like the DASH diet, different ways to incorporate fasting, plant-based approaches, and low-carb diets, including the ketogenic diet. If you haven't listened to those yet, I hope you'll add them to your playlist and get to them soon. But let's get into our discussion of the diets today. Whole30 is a type of elimination diet aimed at removing commonly aggravating foods from your diet for at least 30 days, and then slowly reintroducing foods to identify culprits based on the symptoms you experience with reintroduction of those foods. It is not positioned as a weight loss diet, but rather a reset to identify food sensitivities, to create new healthy food habits, and to break bad ones like using food as a coping mechanism. Paleo and Primal are described as ancestral approaches, which aim to mimic the diet of our ancestors, specifically Paleolithic ancestors before the introduction of processed, refined, mass-produced, and genetically modified foods. So in that sense, you're eliminating most modernized foods, especially the processed stuff, but also grains, legumes, and most dairy, focusing instead on fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, fish, and meats. And then Carnivore and Lion are just like they sound. They cut out basically everything except meat. Carnivore allows meat and some versions of it add eggs and dairy. But if it's possible to be even more restrictive than that, the Lion diet only allows certain kinds of meat, ruminant meat, salt, and water. I do not recommend either the carnivore or the lion diet, but we'll briefly discuss these and the reasons there are much healthier and sustainable alternatives available. With that high-level overview of what we're discussing today, let's jump into Whole30 first. Whole30 was created by Melissa Urban and Dallas Hartwig in April 2009, and they released the first book about the program in 2012 entitled It Starts with Food. They followed this up with the Whole30 in 2014. The original premise was eliminating sugar and sugar-like substances, alcohol, grains, legumes, dairy, and processed foods for 30 days. Then following a reintroduction protocol to understand how each of those categories of food makes you feel. Since then, there have been many more books, cookbooks, and updates to the philosophy, such as a plant-based option for vegans and vegetarians, and allowance of certain ingredients that were originally not allowed on the plan. We get into all of the nitty-gritty during my discussion with Alicia, and I'll wrap up this section following our interview. So without further ado, I am excited to have the first guest of the Nutri Health podcast with us today. Alicia Dowell of Revival Wellness is joining us to share her wisdom on all things Whole30. I've known Alicia since our college days. We worked together at the Student Rec Center, and we had some overlapping classes in nutrition. Alicia has her bachelor's degree in nutrition and is a certified holistic nutritionist, wellness coach, herbalist, and last but not least, high school chemistry teacher. She's passionate about helping women achieve attainable and sustainable wellness through her social channels, sharing her knowledge of weight management, gut health, hormones, and tips for quick and easy family meals. Alicia is goals when it comes to healthy living, and I'm so excited to have her with us today. Alicia, welcome to the Nutri Health podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
First off, I'd love for you to tell us more about your background and training in nutrition.
So like you said, I have a degree in nutrition from A&M, and that was maybe not over, but close to 20 years ago. But in that 20 years, things changed so much. Back then it was like low fat and, the trends were a lot different. And so with nutrition, kind of with any science, it's just, you're learning always. So in that 20 years, I just kind of try to stay on top of not so much the trends, but the advancements in understanding of what our bodies truly need to be well, not even just healthy, but just function well and feel, vivacious and raise my kids to be healthy. And longevity is super important in brain health. And so a few years ago, I went back to school into a holistic wellness pathway. And it was actually at a junior college in the Fort Worth area. And it's just this, I feel like a breakthrough program developed by this, also a fellow Aggie with a PhD in nutrition and had been a professor there. And it's just all about the holistic aspect of nutrition and wellness. And she gets a lot into herbalism as well, which is fascinating. And I had never really delved into that. And it just like, I'm obsessed with it now. It's so interesting and for real, like it, I hate to say can cure things. You're not supposed to say that as an herbalist, but it can prevent so many ailments just by kind of dabbling with everyday herbs and plants. And so after that, I am now officially a holistic nutritionist and clinical herbalist. And that's where I am in my journey. Who knows what's next?
Well, you definitely have a wide range of training in different health and wellness topics, but I thought of you when I was building out this episode on Whole30 because I'd seen you post a lot on your social channels with shopping lists and meal ideas for Whole30. So when did you first do Whole30 and what drew you to this program?
I think it was about maybe 2015, and it was just gaining traction. I had just kind of heard a little bit about it. Instagram really had just been invented. So there was not this thing as like a social, phenomenon at that point. So I don't even remember how I heard about it, but I knew that eliminating processed foods was important and something I kind of always tried to do, but without much structure. And so when I started reading more about Whole30, I was really bought in. And with our nutrition background and that biochemistry and the metabolism background, everything in the book really made sense to me and kind of clicked for just how to really not only eliminate processed foods, and we'll get into this in a minute, I'm sure, but it's an elimination diet of anything that can be a common trigger or food sensitivity to just all kinds of things, not feeling well. And so I tried it. I was having some joint pain and I was reading up on that, some autoimmunity things. And I tried the Whole30 really for that purpose. And ever since then, I've probably done about 4 legitimately, 4 full on for the 30 days, doing it right. Because it is a commitment. It is a situation to commit to the whole 30 days and then the reintroduction too. So,
yeah. I gave a brief introduction to the program earlier in the episode, but for someone who is new to Whole30, what are the core principles of the program?
So you are eating whole foods only for 30 days. And ultimately what that accomplishes is eliminating processed foods, chemicals in your foods, toxins, and then triggers, any sort of common food sensitivity or things that can trigger like autoimmunity or hormone imbalances. So for 30 days, you are preparing everything from scratch. Nowadays, though, 10 years after I've tried my first one, there are a lot of companies built around providing some more convenience. You can get mayonnaise and ketchup now that are Whole30 approved in a bottle. You don't have to make everything. But yeah, it is just whole foods and eliminating a lot of those common triggers like gluten and dairy and some other things for 30 days.
Yes, you really are cutting out all processed foods, all sugar and sugar substitutes, alcohol, and then, like you mentioned, those foods that can be aggravating to some people, such as grains, legumes, and dairy. And while this is only for a 30-day period, I know this can feel extreme for many people. But there's clearly a reason, or many potential reasons, people have gravitated to Whole30, including what you shared about trying it for the first time because you were experiencing some joint pain. What are the potential benefits someone may experience by following an elimination diet like this for 30 days?
The few that are most important to me are the ability, you're eliminating all kinds of things that really are hard on your liver, alcohol and extra sugar and chemicals, and then dumping in nutrients. And so you're really supporting your body's ability to detox. You're also going to heal your gut in this time, because even if you're not sensitive to some of these triggers like gluten and dairy and legumes or whatever, you're just giving your gut a rest, and you are only feeding it just nourishing foods for 30 days. And then you're kind of you're resetting your taste buds and your brain chemistry, because we become so addicted to convenience foods, and they are built to do that. They are chemically built to addict you. That 30 days without them, your taste buds kind of get that reset, and your brain gets that reset where you prefer, carrots and bell peppers for the crunch as opposed to Doritos. And so those are the 3 main things, but there's so many amazing side effects. My skin got clearer. If you have weight to lose, it is not a weight loss diet, but if you have weight to lose, you're probably going to shed some pounds. Your hormones get balanced as kind of a side effect of healing the gut and the blood sugar. And then your energy just skyrockets once you get through that first week or so of like eliminating sugar and alcohol, and you start to feel better. You just feel like you could conquer the world. I remember one Saturday morning, I was up at 6:30, like Windexing my French door windows, and I was like, "What? Who am I? What is this?" You feel just like a superhero once you just clean out your system and just get so balanced and clean. Feels amazing.
Yeah, well, I know people have reported a really wide range of benefits, and the Whole30 website even has what they call non-scale victory, or NSV checklists for these types of benefits. So you can kind of track some of those off-scale improvements like digestion, how your body feels, your mood, sleep, and the like. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. It does kind of just make sense that people will feel better overall when they cut out added sugars, alcohol, and processed foods. But we also know this is a commitment. You said earlier, it's a situation. So what are some questions people should ask themselves before committing to Whole30? Like, what should they be prepared for as they start this program?
I think the word prepare itself is probably the most important keyword. You have to, like on Sunday, if you work from home, or if you're maybe a stay-at-home, mom, you might have a little more flexibility where you can prepare your lunch, as you're ready to eat it, or cook dinner, from scratch that afternoon. But if you are busy for any reason, you really need to spend some hours on Sunday and get everything prepared where you can just dump it on a sheet pan or in a crock pot for dinner. You need to have your lunches prepped, so it is just grab and go. One thing I noticed after a week or so, I usually would wake up not hungry, and that is not a good sign. That is like a cortisol wacky situation. Your circadian rhythm is wrong. And so I noticed I was waking up hungry for breakfast a little bit into the program. So then you got to get your breakfast prepped, make your egg muffins. Like, you cannot grab and go anything processed, not a granola bar, even if it's organic, because there's so many foods that you're eliminating in that 30 days. So my first tip would be just commit to, 4 to 5 Sundays, depending on where you are in your 30 days, where that falls, really preparing your meals for the week. And they don't have to be extravagant. It can be baked chicken and broccoli, with a Whole30 approved, like Tessie Mae's dressing. But you have to be ready to make your food at home. Eating out is really hard. So that's the main thing. And then the other thing that I would do, and I still do this anytime I do a Whole30, I spend a week before eliminating those things that I am kind of hooked on, like sodas, or creamer in my coffee. All you can put in your coffee, if you put something in it, is nut pods, or like a Whole30 approved almond milk or coconut milk. There is no sugary coffee creamer, and that one used to be really hard for me. So you don't want to do that all on day one of your Whole30, quit all that cold turkey, because you want to focus on the positives of it. It's not, you don't want to feel like you're withholding from yourself. So get off of all those things that you're kind of dependent on, that that you cannot have on Whole30 ahead of time. And then that will just really enhance your experience during that 30 days and make that first few days a lot easier too.
I think that's great advice, giving yourself a run-in period where you're slowly tapering off some of those things that you think you can't live without. Good points to consider. And we're going to share your social media info at the end of this clip so people can follow you for some great meal ideas and recipes. But okay, now I've sufficiently psyched myself up for starting Whole30. What are the best resources for someone looking to do this program for the first time?
I really would read the book. I think it's called It Starts With Food, Whole30, It Starts With Food, because it gives you the science behind it all. Like, why are you doing this? How does this help you? What is this going to feel? It's going to give you a rundown of, like, these days you're not going to feel very well. These days, you might have this symptom. And then nowadays with social media, you can find Whole30 approved recipes all over Pinterest and Instagram. But Whole30 does have a cookbook that is maybe 30-minute meals or something. And that one has some incredible recipes that I still make, even when I'm not on Whole30, and my family loves them. And then on the Whole30 website, there was a printable sheets that I literally printed out and would grocery shop with, of all of the ingredients that you're not allowed to have, all the different names for the sugars or the, emulsifiers that you're not supposed to have. And that helped me so much. Really, you just try to stick with ingredients that you recognize, but if you're getting, sometimes like canned pasta sauces or coconut milks, have some things in there that are Whole30 approved. And so it's just nice to have a list. That was a huge help for me when I first started and before I knew what brands I could depend on for my, sauces and preserved things.
Yeah, and I know like many of the eating approaches we've discussed on this podcast, there have been some updates to the restricted additives since that original launch. So I think the Whole30 website will be the most up-to-date place for people to have the current info. We'll put links in the show notes that can get you to the right place for those. Now, we all know drastic dietary shifts can be challenging. What are your top preparation tips for people to do before they start?
So I don't clean my pantry out because my kids don't do the Whole30 with me. They'll eat the meals, but I will also give them rice, or pasta with it. So they aren't against it, but I just want to make sure they're getting enough calories and carbohydrates to support growth and, brain function. Because I am not a children's dietitian by any means. So I don't necessarily clean my pantry out, but I make sure I have on hand snacky things. So I have my go-to snacks like apples and an approved almond butter is always a good snack on Whole30. It's filling and it's got some good macros in there. So and nuts. I eat a lot of nuts on Whole30. So anything that you can just grab and go when you're hungry and you feel like you just are going to cheat and there is no cheating. First of all, if you break the Whole30, technically you are supposed to go back to day one because then it damages the gut, right when you introduce that, food that you weren't supposed to consume. So you just want to have enough on hand where you can grab something and go if you're hungry and you feel like if you don't have something immediately, you're just going to go for the granola bar or the bag of chips.
Perfect. Okay, so once someone has started the program, what are the types of things they should be tracking or not tracking? I know one of the big ones is no scale for 30 days. What about other things like calories?
It is not a weight loss program. Now, again, with balancing everything and cleaning out, you will likely lose some weight and you're going to lose water weight. So it's not to say like, don't do this if you would like to lose weight. It's an excellent way to do that. But you don't need to worry about the scale. You can eat as much as you want. You don't have to track macros on the program. But one thing that I would be careful of when you're eliminating a lot of processed foods and carbs, you can have carbs, you can have potatoes and sweet potatoes, but you're eliminating grains. A lot of times it's hard to get enough electrolytes. And so you want to make sure you're getting your minerals in, whether that's with something like an element or, a mineral powder, or just making sure you're taking a multivitamin and salt and herbs and, things that you season your foods with, that's are great sources of minerals. So you want to make sure you're getting those. That's always something that I feel depleted in if I'm not careful when I do a Whole30 that first week or so.
Okay, so no scale, no calorie or macro tracking needed, but there are a few things to keep an eye on, like getting enough electrolytes and other minerals. Despite the fact that you don't have to count calories or macros, you're still only allowed those whole foods that we've discussed, and you have to make sure you're not consuming any of the no foods or additives. What tips do you have for dealing with challenges people might face while they're on the program, like going out to eat, attending social events, or having to feed your kids different meals?
So there are ways to eat out, but you just have to be very explicit with your waiter. You have to just tell them, I want this chicken and just grilled. Like, I don't want your oil. I don't want butter, not even their seasoning, because, it's probably laden with MSG and sugar. And then you can be that person and carry like something in your bag. I have carried dressings to restaurants before, or your own seasonings. The dressing is the best tip because you can get a salad and just say no dressing on it. And then you can put a Tessie Mae's is usually my go-to for dressings. And I will carry a Tessie Mae's in my purse to just smother a salad with. So you can eat out and you can go to social functions, but you just kind of have to be conscious of what you're putting in your mouth. But that's kind of the whole mindset shift, that mindless eating at a party where you're just snacking because you're hanging out by the hors d'oeuvres. Like, that's part of the shift in that 30 days. You get to the end of the 30 days and you realize that you don't need to do that. And you don't need to sit on your couch and have a bag of chips because you're not dependent on that, like, mindless snacking, and your taste buds and your brain chemistry aren't addicted to those like lab made flavors. So it is a process. Keep Tessie Mae's in your purse or hot sauce or something. And just, I am just honest with my friends. Like, oh, I'm doing a Whole30. I'll be there, but I'm not going to eat, or I'm going to eat ahead of time, or I'm going to have a dressing in my purse. I'm just very open about it.
Well, those are some great tips for helping in those inevitable social situations that are going to come up during a 30-day period. Let's talk about after 30 days. After someone completes the 30-day program, what comes next? Is it straight back to eating all of those things you cut out for 30 days?
It is super important not to, on day 31, like, go to McDonald's and just eat everything you've been missing, because you need to do a proper, what Whole30 calls, and any elimination diet calls, the reintroduction period. So everything that you have taken out of your diet, you don't have to live without. Like, you gradually put them back in, and you evaluate how you feel. So you do the ones that are probably not an issue first, like added sugars or legumes or your non-gluten grains, like your rice and your oatmeal. And you eat it for a day, and they don't gorge, but, have some things. And then you need to give it another 2 days to see how you feel. Some of those things that really bother your gut or cause some reactions, like the sore joints or the headaches or the tummy upset, are not immediate. It's hours to a day. So you reintroduce one thing, one ingredient, give yourself some time, and then the next thing. And if you feel okay after the oatmeal or the added sugar, then you can keep it in your diet in moderation. You want to save things that are very common triggers of a lot of problems for last. So gluten, dairy, alcohol, those are things that you want to do last, because those are, I would say, gluten at very last, and then see how you feel on that. And then even the slightest deterioration of how you feel, grogginess or brain fog, it doesn't have to be a tummy ache. Those are signs that food bothers you, and you don't have to eliminate it forever, but now you have a choice. If you want to eat that cake, you can, but just know the next day you might have some sore joints or headaches. So it's not about like being perfect forever. It's about knowing what triggers you or makes you feel less than great, and you have the choice to make the rest of your life how you want to feel when you eat those items.
So no going crazy. It's definitely a structured reintroduction, and it should be, because the whole purpose behind cutting out all those things for 30 days is to identify what you're sensitive to. If you reintroduce them all back at once, there's no way to tease that out, and you've blown your hard work over the last 30 days. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, before we wrap up here, we always like to mention if there are people who should not consider doing a plan like this. Is there anyone who shouldn't do Whole30?
Like I said, I don't have my kids do it, but I don't think that means that kids shouldn't, as long as you are getting them enough calories and carbohydrates. Like, you're going to want to load them up on potatoes and things. But with kids, I just don't see a point unless they are seriously having some issues, like if you suspect gluten or dairy. And there are less extreme elimination diets as well. And then you can do Whole30 pregnant. You just, again, you have to make sure you're getting enough nourishment and calories and carbohydrates to grow your baby and keep yourself healthy as well. And again, like, I am not a medical professional. That would all probably need to be run by, the pediatrician or the doctor.
Yes. And for those listening, I'm going to do a more detailed contraindications section for all of the approaches that we're covering in today's episode a little bit later. So make sure to listen to that as well, or you can find it via the timestamps if you want to go ahead and just skip there. Alicia, you've really provided a wonderful overview of Whole30 for our audience today. I know this information is going to be incredibly helpful for them. Any last tidbits of Whole30 wisdom you have for us today that we haven't already covered?
No, other than just, it does not have to be complicated. You don't have to make a gourmet from scratch meal every night. You can literally have taco meat made in the fridge, chicken breasts, some veggies. It doesn't have to be as big of an undertaking as it feels like it's going to be, because it's already going to be kind of challenging enough. Like we talked about, the eating out kind of is off the table. And anything convenient is really off the table as well. So it does not have to be as hard as it seems.
Well, Alicia, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of this helpful information for those interested in trying the Whole30 approach. Tell people where they can find you.
I am on Instagram at revival_wellness, and I'm on Facebook as well, but Instagram more than anything.
Perfect. We will put that information in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for your time today, Alicia.
Yes, thank you.
Let's summarize Whole30 and what we just learned from my chat with Alicia. Whole30 is a type of elimination diet aimed to help you identify foods and beverages that create unwanted symptoms or feelings for you. You're cutting out all processed foods, added sugar and sugar substitutes, including sweeteners like stevia, monk fruit, aspartame, and sucralose, to name a few. All alcohol, all grains, legumes, with a few exceptions like green beans and peas, and all dairy for 30 days. In addition, one thing we didn't touch on with Alicia is that you aren't recreating any of your favorite junk food alternatives. They call it the pancake rule, and it's designed to keep you from trying to substitute those junk foods with an alternative, even if it would be considered a healthy alternative. So no cakes or muffins, even if they're made with Whole30 approved foods, no pancakes, essentially no recreation of a processed food that you might be missing. You can see more on the website for the reasoning behind this. What you can have includes whole, unprocessed foods like meat, seafood, and eggs, lots of vegetables and fruits, natural fats from things like avocados, olive oil, nuts, and seeds, and then herbs, certain spices and seasonings, Whole30 approved sauces and dressings. Also note, the company did launch a plant-based option in 2022. So if you don't eat meat, there's now a separate plant-based program that you can find on their website, specific for people who follow a vegetarian or vegan eating pattern. Because if you followed the original plan that removes grains and legumes, including soy, that really would be too restrictive for vegans and vegetarians. So special plan for that. Check it out on their website. Unlike many of the low-carb approaches that we've covered previously, you're not limited on carbs with Whole30. You can eat all forms of potatoes, all vegetables, all fruits, nuts, and seeds. You're not limited on carbs at all because you're not counting those macros we talked about, but you're not getting carbs from grains, legumes, or processed foods. There's a wide range of potential benefits you may experience doing the Whole30 program, from reduced cravings, better energy and sleep, to better digestion, reduce symptoms of inflammation, and better mood. It's really going to be different for everyone. And as we touched on in the chat, I'll put several Whole30 website links to resources in the show notes that will cover all of this in more detail if you're interested to start Whole30. You're not tracking your weight, your measurements, your calories, or your macros like carbs on this plan. You are really just sticking to the yes foods and avoiding the no's for 30 days. After 30 days, you should follow that reintroduction period in the recommended order, which is on their website, introducing a single food group, such as legumes, on a single day. So you have a serving of that food at every meal that day, and you're monitoring yourself for any changes in how you feel, both that day and then the 2 to 3 days after. Those 2 to 3 days after you reintroduce the food group, you go back to eating Whole30 so that you can really evaluate what that one day of eating the food, like the legumes, how that affected how you feel and any symptoms. You'll do this approach for all the groups listed on their site, adding in one per day, then back to Whole30 diet for 2 to 3 days to assess those effects. This really allows you to figure out the types of foods that work for you and those that don't. There are a bunch of different ways you can approach reintroduction, from that simple method I just laid out to getting more specific and really trying to isolate specific foods if you suspect a particular food like corn may be causing issues. If all of this sounds overwhelming, there are plenty of resources online, on their website, on social media. Of course, you could read the latest books. And there are also Whole30 certified coaches that can help you navigate through all of this. There are certainly plenty of critics of Whole30, but to be honest, I don't really understand the criticisms. This is not meant to be a long-term way of eating. It's an elimination diet for 30 days where you're eliminating certain food groups for that 30-day period and then reintroducing them one by one to help you feel better. It promotes non-processed whole foods, lots of fruits and vegetables, moderate protein, and healthy fats. So while, yes, you are removing some foods that can also be considered healthy, like legumes and whole grains, for a period of 30 days, it's short-term and it's for a purpose. That said, we will cover a few different approaches to other elimination diets in our final episode of the series next week. So if you want some different options for an elimination diet, check out next week's episode as well. Next up, we have Paleo and Primal. I group these together because Primal is basically a slightly different take on Paleo. The ideas that have kind of melded into what we know today as the caveman, Paleolithic, or Paleo diet originated in the 1970s by a gastroenterologist who proposed many health problems of the day stemmed from dietary changes that have occurred due to agriculture and industrializations as our diets moved away from the diet of our Paleolithic ancestors. In the 1980s, a couple of other doctors wrote a paper that said human physiology and genetics were shaped by the environment and diet of the Paleolithic era. So basically, humans haven't had time to adapt and evolve to handle the types of foods we were consuming back in the 80s, much less what we consume now 40 years later. 2002 is when the popularity began to really grow when a professor from Colorado State University, Lauren Cordain, published a book called The Paleo Diet. The book establishes paleo guidelines based on Dr. Cordain's research of the evolutionary aspects of the human diet and why we should eat more like our hunter-gatherer Paleolithic ancestors. Now, I'm not speaking to the historical accuracy of what our Paleolithic ancestors did or didn't eat. I'm not going to get into that debate, which you can find plenty of online if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But that's just the background of where this eating approach started and how it got to what is promoted today as paleo. Here are the basic paleo diet rules. Some paleo followers use the motto, if it doesn't fly, swim, walk, or isn't green, don't eat it. You're eating clean and non-processed meats. I'll explain more on that in a moment. Wild-caught fish, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. For the meat, the closer to natural, the better, meaning you want to aim for grass-fed, grass-finished beef over grain-fed and finished, pasture-raised poultry and eggs versus an indoor farm. But that's really something that's encouraged or preferred, but not required if that's not accessible to you. You are generally limiting fatty meats and focusing on leaner options to avoid saturated fats. You are avoiding all processed foods, grains, legumes, dairy, alcohol, and refined sugars and oils like most seed oils. This also means no processed meats like sausages, deli meats, and bacon, even uncured bacon. So this might sound a lot like Whole30, right? Many of those things you're cutting out are the same things you cut out for 30 days with Whole30. The difference being you don't add them back in with paleo. You don't consume them as long as you're following a paleo eating pattern. That said, after the initial 2002 book, there have been many additional takes on the paleo diet and variations that include some components of these restricted food groups. For instance, many allow ghee, a clarified butter, to be consumed because it's just the butter fat, and milk solids have been removed. Some also do fermented milk products like kefir, which can be lower in lactose. Some strict paleoers don't drink coffee, while others think it's fine to have black coffee. Honestly, you'll find a lot of variation in what different people or groups call paleo, so you can start in the strictest sense and adapt slightly based on your preferences. The Wahls protocol is another variation of paleo that was developed by a medical doctor to treat her own multiple sclerosis diagnosis. It's very similar to what we would call traditional paleo, but you do cut out eggs and nightshade vegetables, which include tomatoes, eggplant, potatoes, and peppers. Some following the regular paleo diet cut out nightshades as well, but it's more about whether you tolerate them with the original. We'll touch on this again in the health benefits section. Another variation came from author and endurance athlete Mark Sisson in his book, The Primal Blueprint, published in 2009. The book was kind of based on a paleo approach, but is both less restrictive on the foods recommended, and it also extended to other lifestyle areas outside of diet, with 10 principles or habits of the blueprint. I'm going to share some of the key ones here and let you read more in the book or on his website if you're interested. Some of the principles include eating lots of plants and animals. This is where he expands on his dietary philosophy and why perhaps certain additional foods or food groups could be added to the original paleo approach, such as occasional raw and fermented dairy, saturated fats, fermented soy, and occasional legumes and alcohol. It's like the more lenient cousin of paleo. And for the record, since I haven't defined them yet in this episode, legumes includes beans, soybeans, chickpeas, peanuts, and lentils. Other principles of primal include moving more, including light movement like more walking, lifting some heavy stuff like weights or body weight exercises, and doing really high intensity exercises a few times a month. I think he says like every 10 days. Getting adequate sleep and sunlight and stimulating your brain are a few others in the blueprint. It's basically paleo with other lifestyle advice. The author did have a popular blog for a long time called Mark's Daily Apple, which now directs you to his Primal Kitchen website. And I mention that because Primal Kitchen mainly sells a line of condiments, sauces, dressing, and supplements that are paleo friendly. So if you're interested in one of these paleo-based approaches, there are now many companies like this that sell paleo certified packaged foods, ironically enough, However, I am a fan of some of these options because they'll do healthy swaps. So they'll swap avocado oil for a more processed oil like soybean oil. So sometimes I look for paleo approved because they're generally made with real ingredients and they don't contain the artificial stuff. I think it would be hard for anyone to argue that the approaches we've discussed thus far, Whole30, Paleo, or Primal, would not be an improvement on the current standard American diet. Any approach that promotes plenty of vegetables and fruits, good sources of protein, healthy fats, and limiting of processed foods and sugar is generally a solid approach in my opinion. I think some people get caught up in the details, like removing a certain food group they consider healthy, such as dairy or legumes. However, as long as you're getting the nutrients your body needs, I don't think there's anything wrong with removing a food group like those promoted in these approaches, especially if you feel better without them. But there are a few nutrients you'll need to keep an eye on to make sure that you're getting enough of following these eating approaches. One is calcium, especially if you're removing dairy products long term. Supplementing calcium may not be the best option for everyone, so if you plan to cut out dairy indefinitely, talk to your doctor about potential calcium supplementation. The gist is you don't want to spike blood calcium levels really high at once with like one big dose, so you do want to take lower doses along with vitamin D3 to help with absorption. However, some paleo purists would also not take supplements due to those not being available to our ancestors. So I do think you'll have to take a personalized approach and discuss what's right for your needs with a healthcare professional. Vitamin D is another one. This can be a challenge no matter what diet you follow. We've mentioned it in a few other episodes. Because these approaches are whole foods based and you're not consuming commonly fortified foods like dairy milk and cereals, you do want to keep an eye on vitamin D. You can get plenty if you're able to get a little bit of sun exposure on your arms and legs each day because our bodies can naturally make vitamin D if we give it some sunlight. Obviously, just be careful not to burn your skin or otherwise cause yourself harm out in the sun. A few other potential ones to watch out for include iron, magnesium, potassium, and folate, especially for women of childbearing age. Folate is critical for proper fetal development, so it's important to make sure you're getting adequate levels of folate before pregnancy. And since this is something that's often fortified in cereals and enriched grains, you'll have to focus on getting that from whole food sources on these eating approaches. Good sources include spinach and asparagus, followed by avocado, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli. And beef liver is also a great source if you're up for that. If you're following the plant-based Whole30, you'll want to be cautious of the common nutrient shortfalls for vegans and vegetarians, which I cover in more detail in episode 4. But those include protein, iron, zinc, several of the B vitamins and vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, calcium, choline, and iodine. The take home for me with regard to the non-vegetarian whole food approaches is you're probably going to be getting more beneficial nutrients than you were before, especially if you were previously consuming a more standard American diet, high in processed foods. If you aim to eat a variety of fruits, vegetables, meats, seafood, nuts, and seeds, you'll most likely be fine on those important nutrients. But if there are areas of a particular concern for some reason, you can work with a qualified healthcare professional to tailor an approach for you. While we're here, let's talk about who shouldn't go for one of these approaches. We've covered a lot of different contraindications in the previous episodes. Basically, if you have a medical condition, and especially if you're on medication for a medical condition, you should discuss any potential dietary changes with your prescriber. Why? Because a lot of medications can be affected either directly by the foods you're consuming, like in the case of warfarin and increased vitamin K intake, or indirectly by the potential health benefits of the diet, like lowered blood pressure or improved insulin sensitivity. If you're on a medication for high blood pressure or taking insulin for diabetes management, and you alter those parameters, you're likely going to need to adjust your medication dose as well. So that's why it's important to have this discussion ahead of time so your doctor or healthcare provider can monitor any potential outcomes that are going to affect your dosing and other considerations. And of course, please do not stop or adjust any medications without the guidance of your healthcare professional. If you have a medical condition such as chronic kidney disease, you likely need to be on a specialized diet, so check with your healthcare provider on that. If you're pregnant, planning to become pregnant, or breastfeeding, again, the whole foods-based approaches are likely going to be great in those scenarios, but there might be particular nutrients you need to ensure you're getting or supplementing with a prenatal vitamin, and considerations such as limiting raw or undercooked seafood and taking mercury levels into consideration. Please remember, everything in our discussion of these different dietary patterns is not individualized dietary or medical advice, and I am not a medical doctor or a registered dietitian. Okay, that's all the nitty-gritty about potential nutrition shortfalls and contraindications. Let's talk about the good stuff now, potential benefits. The potential health benefits of a whole foods-based approach, whether it be Whole30, Paleo, or Primal, are going to be pretty similar. While not specifically weight loss diets, you will most likely lose weight by removing all processed foods, alcohol, and added sugars from your diet. You'll likely improve your blood sugar control and insulin levels when your carbohydrates come from whole food sources like fruits and vegetables versus processed sources. Inflammation will likely decrease, which may lead to reductions in overall pain, but you may particularly notice it in your joints or the areas that you tend to have pain from inflammation. Since these are really diets of the 2000s, there isn't the same body of scientific research on them that we've seen for some of the other eating approaches we've covered. A paleo approach called the Wahls protocol or Wahls diet, created for patients with multiple sclerosis, shows some improvements in weight, BMI, cholesterol, fatigue scores, and severity of depression and anxiety in those patients. But the studies are very few, and the results are similar to some other MS dietary interventions that have been looked at. A study in 9 sedentary but non-obese participants put these people on a weight-maintaining paleo-style diet for 10 days. And after 10 days, they had reduced blood pressure, a reduction in insulin levels during an oral glucose tolerance test, reductions in total and LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. A meta-analysis of 8 studies showed the paleo diet reduced body weight by a few pounds, waist circumference by a little over an inch, BMI, body fat slightly, systolic and diastolic blood pressure by about 5 and 3 millimeters of mercury respectively, and total cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL cholesterol slightly. The analysis also showed a reduction in C-reactive protein, or CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, and a slight increase in good or HDL cholesterol. So a lot of potential positives here, especially for cardiovascular risk factors. But the authors note the evidence is not conclusive and more trials are needed. These dietary approaches are similar to the Mediterranean diet, but with a greater focus on animal products and the exclusion of most dairy and legumes, with those exceptions that we mentioned, and the reintroduction options that you have with Whole30. So despite the lack of research on these patterns, I think it's reasonable to expect similar health effects to the Mediterranean approach, and that's where the data seems to point currently with those benefits we just reviewed. Now, I did say I would briefly discuss the Carnivore and Lion diets here at the end. As mentioned in the introduction, these are two meat-based approaches that have gained popularity really in the last few years. The carnivore generally allows for any kind of meat, though you can also get technical on that point, limited dairy if you tolerate it, and eggs if you tolerate and or have a preference for them, as well as some herbs and seasonings to your preference. I don't know exactly who came up with this plan originally, but there's a medical doctor named Sean Baker who wrote the first book, I think, on it called The Carnivore Diet. And another medical doctor, Dr. Paul Saladino, also has a book and made the diet very popular on social media. The Lion Diet is promoted by, I guess I would call her an influencer named Michaela Peterson Fuller, who has no medical or nutrition training. She claims she developed this diet as an extreme elimination diet after years of trying to address multiple autoimmune and psychiatric illnesses. The rules of this one are only ruminant meat, so that's cows, bison, deer, moose, sheep, goat, and then salt and water. Now, to be fair, apparently there are some different ways you can do it, and you can start with the less extreme approach and only get down to the pure lion diet if cutting out many other food groups along the way doesn't solve your issues. With both carnivore and lion, the claim is that compounds in plants can be aggravating or even poisonous in a way to our gut, and they can trigger autoimmune responses and other negative effects. It's true that most plants have natural defense mechanisms or chemicals to protect themselves from being eaten, and that's one of the arguments made about why we shouldn't eat some or most plants. So without getting too much in the details here, some allow for a spectrum of consuming certain plants that are deemed least toxic, like fruits. Here's my take on it. I think most proponents of these approaches saying there are no problems with high saturated fat intake, high protein intake, high animal meat consumption, etc., are eating pretty clean diets in terms of not having processed foods or refined sugars in them. But to promote it as something to the general public that the general public should do, it really disregards the complexity of human behaviors. I think the greater danger of these approaches is in partial compliance. The people that are going to say, well, this doctor eats a ton of animal meat and doesn't worry about saturated fat, and he looks great and his blood tests are great, and that should work for me. And then they add those fatty meats and heavy cream and egg yolks to their normal diet, but they don't go full carnivore. They go meat heavy. So then you're in a situation where you're adding all this stuff that might be okay in an extreme instance like the carnivore diet, but combined with other negative aspects of the American diet, like still consuming processed foods or alcohol or lots of sugar, then you're creating this perfect storm for increased obesity, increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, cancers, all those things that we're trying to fix, right? Another thing these diets seem to have in common is that the people who ultimately adopt them seem to do so out of desperation. They had autoimmune type conditions that everything they had tried had not seemed to work. This is not going to be the majority of the population. So that's one of the issues I have with people promoting these plans as something anyone and everyone should follow. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I have all the answers by any means. I think if you have truly tried many of the other approaches we've discussed, you've worked with specialists and you've done elimination type diets to try to identify your triggers, you feel like you eat a healthy diet and be honest, if you're cutting out the processed foods and foods that you know you should avoid, you're physically active, you've checked all the boxes and nothing has worked. At that point, maybe I would consider such a restrictive approach, but I would also not plan to stay on it long term. I would use it as a way to see if you could feel better first And then if the answer is yes, slowly start reintroducing individual foods or food groups to assess the effects like we've already discussed for like a Whole30 reintroduction process. I've tried not to give a strong opinion through most of this series, but rather to kind of lay out the facts about each eating approach. But I draw the line with some of these really extreme approaches with that caveat I just described. Okay, so I will get off my soapbox for now. I'll wrap this one up by saying Whole30, Paleo, and Primal are whole foods-based approaches that have varying degrees of restriction with regard to certain food groups. If a more moderate approach, like the Mediterranean or a healthy low-carbohydrate diet, isn't working for your health goals, it might be helpful to try one of these other options. I don't recommend the incredibly restrictive carnivore or lion diets, but I hope I fairly described those in a general way and explained why they could be considered in a more extreme case. In the next episode, we'll cover a few remaining dietary approaches, including low FODMAP diets, other elimination style approaches to identify food sensitivities, intuitive eating, and how to adapt some of the approaches that we've covered for specific needs. Hey, thanks for listening today. I hope you learned something new, that you have enough information to decide if you want to try any of these approaches we discussed today, and you have the tools to take the next steps when you're ready. Please leave any questions or comments you have about this episode in the comments section of our YouTube channel. You can find us at Nuchi Health, that's NUCHI Health, there and on all social platforms. And if you learned something helpful or enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on our social accounts and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Those interactions are going to help us grow and help us make a bigger impact. I've also linked my Ko-fi page in the show notes where you can make a contribution to the show if you'd like to support us in that way. Thank you for being here, for your desire to learn and improve your health, and for letting us be part of that health journey. I'll see you soon.